Good morning, everyone. I think Steve's done a really good job, actually, for me in terms of introducing everyone to what we mean in terms of cloud technology, what we mean by virtualization, private cloud, public cloud, etc. So those are some of the things that hopefully we've set a good baseline in terms of understandings. What I'm really going to talk about is security in the cloud itself. So again, this morning we've already heard about some of the risks that we need to bear in mind in terms of the cloud. And some of them are misconceptions, some of them are things that we should really be thinking about. Title is very interesting for this presentation, and I'll apologize now because I am an evangelist, so I'll try and be negative on some things, but I think you'll find, hopefully, by the end of this presentation that we've actually covered off a lot of the common misconceptions that people typically have. So the agenda was set for me in terms of what I was supposed to cover. And these are some of the questions that we'll answer. And Steve's probably addressed some of these issues already, but we'll look at it in a little bit more detail in terms of security. So the things that I'm going to look at is, are cloud security issues new? Is it something that, oh my God, we're not going to move to the cloud? I was talking to some financial services customers a few months ago, and out of 10 people in the room, 10 people put their hands up and said, we don't have a cloud strategy today, and we don't really have plans to have a cloud strategy. We don't really see in the future that we'll be doing anything with the cloud. And that's an interesting mindset, if you like, in terms of what people are doing when it comes to security. But you'll see that security isn't necessarily a new concept. It's just how you actually deploy it in the cloud that's different. So I'll cover some of those things. We talked about data loss already, so I'll highlight some of the things that you need to think about when you think about data loss itself. And then also talk a little bit about cloud service providers. What's their role? What can they offer you? And also at each of these points, I'll try and give you some proof points in terms of advances either in technology, things that we're doing, things that we've seen our customers doing, to help alleviate some of the concerns that people have. And then finally, I'll end with how do you build a trusted cloud? So what are the things that you need to think about? And again, important to point out that some of the things I'm going to talk about apply both to if you're building a private cloud, but also if you're going to be using some kind of hybrid cloud, then it's really a combination of best practices and some of the things that you could use to deploy that. So do you trust the cloud? It's interesting because cloud security is something that's been talked about probably for about 4 years now, and everybody has a different idea about it in terms of, is the cloud a trustworthy environment? The reality is we probably all use the cloud. As consumers, we probably all have access to the cloud. We probably store data in the cloud. Apple is talking about the iCloud, where you can have all your apps, etc., all in the cloud. So the reality is that as consumers, we probably use the cloud every day. But from a business or an enterprise perspective, obviously that's different. And then if you've got sensitive information, then that's different as well. So some of the common ideas around, being able to have multi-tenancy, so being able to keep data services separate or virtual machines separate, are all the sorts of things that were talked about in the early days. And these are some of the concerns that we used to talk about a few years ago, but obviously that's changed a lot as we go along. And interestingly, I think when it comes to cloud service providers, it's the people who will have the right mix of technologies, the right mix of processes. Again, we've heard this morning that security isn't just about technology. We know security is about people, process, and technology. So if you've got the technology piece, you need to make sure that the other two elements are there as well. And I think it's the cloud service providers who have that will actually win in this race. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we're talking to talking to cloud service providers about, and some of the things that they're already doing. Here's an interesting, I'm sure you've seen lots of different statistics around. This is an interesting statistics in terms of, we asked, when you're deploying cloud services, is security always something that you think about? And you can see that almost a huge 76% are actually not really focusing on the impact in terms of security of using a cloud-based service. So only 24% are saying yes, in all cases we do it. And again, it's an interesting thought, because I think a lot of organizations, certainly a lot of big organizations, tend to go and buy cloud services. You know, Steve talked about how cheap it is to go and buy compute power. Well, you know, in organizations where they do a lot of R&D, for example, they might decide to go and buy compute power, but if the CISO of their organization, you may not even know that they're actually buying this compute power. So it's really important that, you know, any cloud service that's deployed, you know, you're aware of it. So, you know, if you're responsible for security in an organization, then you're aware of the risk, if you like, of deploying cloud-based services. But also, if you're not focusing on security, then you're actually not moving ahead. So you're actually missing the business opportunity of using the cloud, because the cloud is a real opportunity to reduce your cost and to get much better services. We all know the benefits of moving to the cloud. So, you know, if you're saying, well, you know, it's not secure and therefore we're not even thinking about security and we're not going to use the cloud, then you're actually missing that opportunity. This is another interesting statistic, which actually only came out last week, and I'll apologize for those of you who can't see it from the back. Basically, the top two things on this slide, and it's from Gartner, is cloud computing and virtualization. And they've actually remained the same in 2010 and 2011. They've just changed cloud's actually moved higher up than virtualization. So again, we know that, you know, in terms of CIOs, they're actually looking at the cloud and really looking at deploying it in anger. And I think in the next few years, you'll see a lot of statistics coming out like that, which talk about some of the things that CIOs have on their agenda. And this is an actual quote from one of the CISOs that we spoke to. And what he said is that we're actually deploying cloud services, but we feel like we're flying blind because we know that we have cloud services deployed either from service providers or within our own organization in a private cloud, but we don't really have a complete handle of security. We don't really know exactly what's going on. And you'll hear me talk about two things a lot for the next for the next 40 minutes or so, and that's about control and visibility. So if you're going to use the cloud, then you need to have control and you need to have some level of visibility, particularly if you've got sensitive information. So, and you know, this isn't new. A lot of CISOs, a lot of people responsible for security that we speak to agree with this idea that, you know, we are flying blind, and we hope nothing bad happens to us. So, just going through some of the questions that I was asked to answer for this morning. Are cloud security issues new? Not really. As I said earlier, cloud security itself has nothing to do with the cloud. Security is something new. Security is something you should be doing anyway. So they're actually two separate things. So within your own organizations, without deploying the cloud, you worry about who has access to information, what is information, where is that information, have you classified that information, do you have good policies and processes in place? And how about from a GRC perspective? Are you complying to the regulations that you should be complying to? All of those things you should be doing. They're all good practice. You should be doing within your own organizations today. So when you move to the cloud, if you take those best practices and you move to the cloud, then the reality is that you've had, you know, if it's a private cloud, then that's definitely a good way to go, because you've actually you're taking those best practices with you. There are some differences. The differences will be that some of the current security practices won't work in the cloud, or the way that they're deployed might be different. So if you think about intrusion detection, intrusion prevention, then in a virtual machine environment where you've got multiple virtual machines sitting in the same physical host, that may not necessarily work. But if you do need to deploy them from a regulatory perspective, then you may need to think about different ways of being able to deploy those kind of controls, but you would still need to deploy them in that environment. The other change will be the velocity of change. How quickly can you change those controls? Because if you're thinking about cloud, if you think about virtual machines, then things can change or move at the blink of an eye. So how quickly can your security controls change? How much can you automate and how much can you build in terms of your security policies? How many of those policies can you actually build in so that if something changed, then dynamically you can change a policy and actually set those controls right? So those are some of the things that you should be thinking about in terms of cloud security. So, as I said, security is not new. It's all things that you guys are probably doing already. What you do need is some kind of framework, a common framework, if you like, to take these best practices, regardless of whether they're in your current environment. And it's interesting because, we talk about the distinction of, virtualization, public cloud, private cloud. The reality is most organizations will have some form of hybrid cloud. If you have some form of hybrid cloud, it means that you're going to have possibly physical, you're going to have virtual, you're going to have private, and you may even be buying some public services. So if you have an environment like that, you need to make sure that you have a system, a framework, and policies that are common across that whole platform. Because we know that the less policies you have, the better control you have, and the less seams you have, the less vulnerabilities you have. So you need to think about, being able to reduce the number of policies that you have in that overall hybrid environment. So this is a process that we talk about a lot in terms of being able to create that single system, if you like. And typically the process would start with, what are your key drivers? What is it that you're trying to do from a security perspective? So we talked about some regulations earlier this morning, things like PCI, SOX, but there are obviously lots of other, depending on your industry, lots of other regulations that you may need to comply to. So, and those are really form the information that you feed into this process. So you start off by feeding that information into the whole security process. And then the first thing you would need to do is define a policy. And the policy really talks about how is it within your environment, so if it's a hybrid environment, how is it that within your environment you're going to apply those controls to what we call the 3 I's. And the 3 I's are really about a simple transaction. If you think about a simple transaction that you do every day, whether in your work environment, in your personal environment, it involves 3 things. It's an identity, so it's an individual. It could be a virtual machine. It could be an employee, a customer, even a hacker. It doesn't really matter. So it's an identity accessing some form of information over some form of infrastructure. And really our goal should be to secure that transaction. So in a hybrid environment, in a cloud environment, our goal should be to make sure that we secure that transaction end to end and ensure that the right information gets to the right people in a trusted environment. Of course, if you're going to do that, if you're going to secure each of those 3 areas, then you will typically end up deploying lots of different point products to do that. So for example, if you're going to use PCI, then you may need to deploy encryption. So if you deploy encryption, you're going to have a key management console. So you've already got a policy engine that's associated with that. If you're going to deploy data loss prevention technology, then you're going to have an enterprise management console that manages that environment. So you end up with multiple devices, multiple point tools, which are effectively creating silos within your organization without giving you the overall control and visibility that you would need to manage that kind of environment. But that's really where you would apply those controls, enforce those policies and manage them. And of course, each of those different consoles will actually generate lots of information. So for those of you who are already deploying SIM platforms, for example, you know that you've got thousands of millions. Within EMC, we have millions of incidents that are generated every second globally. So how do you prioritize this? How do you correlate that information? How do you prioritize that information? And it has been proven that every time there is a breach, that information is actually in the logs already, but it's because nobody's actually looking at those logs or being able to prioritize that information that they actually miss that. So how do you look at that information and give it some kind of priority in terms of what you would need to act on. And that really gives you your IT risk, if you like, in terms of that whole system. The next phase is really what I think a lot of organizations struggle with, and that's the business context. So you know what your IT risk is, and that's where typically you would have all your technologies in place. The business risk is really associated with, if something bad happens to something, so if somebody manages to get into a virtual machine, for example, what is the impact of that on my business risk based on the type of data that's on that system, based on the business unit that it's in, on the organization, on the country. So all of those things you can actually deduce, if you like, when you start looking at adding the business context. So that's really the system that we use when we think about creating this a system that actually helps you manage your risk in that kind of environment. So I talked about security and security controls. Some of the things that do change in terms of security, I said the concept of security doesn't change, but some of the things that do change are the ways you think about it. So, of course, perimeter security is no longer true, and that's been the case for many years now. But really moving from perimeter security to information-centric security. What do I mean by that? By information-centric security, I mean being able to have security controls, so actually created when that piece of information is created, when it's been used, when it's stored, and then finally when it's deleted. So again, if you think about the cloud environment, these are some of the security controls that you would need to think about in terms of, if you're going to create your own private cloud or indeed buy a cloud service, then what controls are you going to have with that piece of information? So particularly if it's intellectual property or if it's regulatory information, then you need to think about the information-centric concept in terms of being able to have those controls that effectively live with that piece of information. That also becomes important when you talk to service providers, for example, because they already are talking about moving workloads to different data centers overnight. If they're going to do that, then you need security controls that actually travel with that piece of data as it's moved around. So that's one of the things you need to think about. The second thing is around the controls that you have for that data. So if you think about the controls, typically you would have applied the controls on a blanket basis. That there'd be either application-based controls. But in this environment, because we know that the change is so dynamic, you need to make sure that the controls you have are bolted on, so they're not they're embedded within your cloud infrastructure, as opposed to point tools that actually only manage a very small piece of that infrastructure. So if you think about policies, for example, you need to make sure that you have an overarching policy that affects your whole organization and affects all your sensitive information. And then the final one is an interesting one because we talk about static controls, again, not relevant when we think about the cloud. In the cloud, we need to be a lot more dynamic. But also, we need to be adaptive and behavior-based. And already we're talking to cloud service providers who are looking at technologies to actually look at behaviors, look at transaction types, transaction monitoring, and then based on that, make a decision and almost self-heal. So self-adapt security to make sure that they are mitigating their risks. So that's an interesting concept because you think about the speed at which changes can happen in the cloud, then those 3 points become really important. One of the other things that you would need to consider is how you think about security today. So there is obviously a security stack, and most of you, for those of you who are specifically working in the security space, will have a function of this. But I think what's important here is that you have the control layer, which is where your detection and enforcement takes place. So this is where you would detect any violations to your policy and enforce the right controls. And then the next layer is actually is your operations layer, and this is where you would actually apply those controls, apply those enforcement controls, provision some of those services, and use some of the monitoring and management tools that are available with that. And again, at this layer, you need to think about trying to minimize the number of tools that you have. We're never going to be in an environment where we have a single policy, because that would be nirvana. And that's never going to happen. So you need to think about how you can minimize the number of policies and how much visibility you have into those policies and how much control you have into those policies. And then the final layer is really the GRC requirements, which is, all your regulations. So this is another version, if you like, of the framework example that I put up earlier. What's important here is also the individuals. So if you think about the historic version of this, you would typically have different individuals that are responsible for each of those. When you think about the cloud, now if you're a cloud administrator or a virtualization administrator, you have a lot more visibility because you're actually bringing a lot of those ideas, a lot of those policies together under one single umbrella. So again, it's an opportunity to actually improve some of your security controls that you have in an environment. So that was a little bit about, is security, cloud security new? Is it something different? So moving on to, is cloud more vulnerable to data loss? And again, Steve's already talked about it this morning in terms of data loss. Data loss is a really interesting subject because, again, it's very emotional. I think people make the decision not to go to a cloud service provider because it's an emotional decision, because they say, oh no, we're losing control because we're giving our data away. The reality is that even if you're not using the cloud today, data loss is something that already happens. A lot of organizations don't have a very good handle on data loss because they haven't done their homework. What I mean by that, by not doing their homework, is they haven't looked at or haven't got a really good handle on where their sensitive data is within their organizations, who owns that data, how do you classify that data. A lot of customers are going through that process now of, being able to classify that data and then being able to apply the right policies to that data in terms of, what do you do when you have a violation of policy, and how do you educate your users? How do you remediate effectively so that if there is a breach in terms of data loss, or if somebody's trying to do something which violates your security policy in terms of data loss, then how do you educate them? So none of these concerns are necessarily cloud associated. These are things that, even without going to the cloud, these are things that are relevant in terms of data loss. And obviously, when you do go to the cloud, then the perception, again, is that anybody could have access to your data. But as you've heard already this morning, most cloud service providers have very stringent controls in terms of who has access to that data. The problem comes when you take that data off a service and then either store it onto a desktop, a laptop, or a USB stick. That's where your biggest vulnerabilities are going to come from, when you're actually taking data off somewhere. So typically, if it's in a database or in a cloud service provider environment, then you're usually quite secure. So I think from a data loss perspective, you need to make sure that you're following the best practices, i.e. classifying your data, having the right policies to be able to protect that data. And then also, if there is a violation, what do you do? So to give you a really simple example, we use DLP within our own organization, and every time I violate a policy, and I'm obviously quite naughty because it happens to me quite often, I get a window that pops up which says, you're violating EMC security policy, click here to learn more. And if I click on it, it'll actually tell me why what I'm doing is wrong. So it'll give me some options, because none of us know what our security policies are, right? When we join an organization, we sign a policy which says, this is your security policy, but you never know the actual detail of it. So that's a really good way of being able to offer some kind of remediation or some kind of self-service remediation to make sure that you're not continually violating that policy. So DLP is really important. It's important in the physical environment, but it's also important in the cloud. And again, providing that you've got good practices today, and then you take those into the cloud, then again, that's a good transformation. But if you think that you've got really bad practices today, you haven't classified your data, you don't know what the risk is to that data, and then you move to the cloud, then that's not necessarily going to give you huge benefits because you're effectively taking a bad process and putting it somewhere else. So it's still very relevant in the cloud. To give you a proof point and an example of some of the things that we're looking at, this is an example of DLP technology that's actually embedded within the VMware environment. So what this does is it automatically applies DLP policies to different zones in a virtual environment, which means that if you have data, so in this example, you've got PCI information that's actually sitting in different virtual machines, you can actually automatically classify that data as PCI and apply a PCI security policy based on that. So again, effectively doing it real time and then applying those controls so that you can manage those controls both in a virtual environment, in a private environment, and of course this is something that could be deployed in a data center as well. So that's an example of some of the ways that you could use DLP technology in the cloud. Are private clouds always more secure? Yes and no. Private clouds can be secure. As I said earlier, if you've got best practices and you're taking those best practices with you, so you've got it's the process and procedure bit that's really important. Security is about those three things: technology, people, and processes. And if you're taking broken processes into the private cloud, then that's not necessarily going to be secure. So what you really need to make sure is that you are following best practices. There are really good guidelines produced by VMware, Microsoft, any of the big players within the virtualization space that talk about basic security hardening guidelines, all the good things that you should be doing if you are going to be deploying any cloud-based services. So if you're building a private cloud, then obviously you need to make sure that you follow those guidelines and follow some of the best practices. But actually, private cloud may be a really good opportunity to improve your security as well, provided you do the right things and you take the right steps. So some of the things that change in the cloud in terms of security, and we're going to look at three things, and it's around technology, people and process, and the delivery model itself. So if you think about technology, historically in the physical environment, you've got a stack there where you would have had hardware, software, applications, and you typically would have inserted security controls at each of those different layers in the stack, which meant that you had a disjointed policy, if you like, of being able to secure that stack. If you think about a virtual environment, then you're actually putting that into one stack. So straight away, you've got composite stack. And you can apply security controls, for example, at the hypervisor layer, which means that you're actually applying that control only once. So straight away, because you're only applying it once, you have better control, better visibility, and less seams, as I mentioned earlier, to be able to protect that stack. So it's an opportunity to improve your security. So that's one example. If you think about the people and process piece, typically, again, you would have had multiple individuals, multiple administrators who would have been responsible for specific parts of the IT organization. So you'd have had people who are server managers, network managers, security manager, administration manager. So you'd have had lots of different individuals who are responsible for different parts of that stack. But when you start moving to virtualization and cloud, you have one. I'm not saying you get rid of all those people, by the way, but you have one function, if you like, and that function of virtualization administrator, again, gives them visibility of the entire stack. So there's a lot more correlation in terms of the information they have. They effectively have a single pane of glass, and that's really what you should be aiming for, to have a single pane of glass that allows you to have control of that whole stack. And then the final piece is obviously the delivery model changes itself as well. So how much can you trust a third-party cloud service provider? Is it something you do in-house? If it's a private cloud, then that's fine. But even in a private cloud, you may still be buying some kind of external services. So how do you audit them? How do you use some of the third-party standards that are around to be able to decide on which service provider you should go for? So some of those controls, and of course, as Steve said this morning, cloud service providers, it's their business. That's what they do. So they will have the investment and the technology and the processes in place to be able to provide a secure service. Don't sort of use the emotional thing and say, well, we're not going to give our data away to a cloud service provider because they're not secure. So those are some of the things that change in terms of being able to improve your security. One of the other considerations is that security today is typically inserted either at the application layer or at the OS layer. But again, in the virtualization environment, if you think about applying those controls much deeper into the stack, then it means that you have a lot more consistency in that environment, because again, your controls are much closer. As I said earlier, if you're applying those controls at the hypervisor layer, then it gives you a lot more consistency across that whole virtual machine, and also allows you to start creating trusted zones, trust environments in that virtual machine environment and apply different security policies that live within that same infrastructure. So some of the best practices, and this is by no means a complete list of some of the things that you should consider in terms of a private cloud. Obviously, as I said earlier, use the best practice guidelines that are available from all the key vendors. But obviously, the architectural design of your private cloud is really important, because a lot of organizations will use the private cloud as a footprint into a hybrid or a public environment. So it's good that it's important that you start right and you start deploying the right standards when you start creating that public cloud. So the architecture and design of that is really important. The second point is the sort of common myth, I think, that when people started talking about virtualization in cloud, everybody said, well, if you can compromise the hypervisor, you can compromise any virtual machine. Well, in theory, you could. If you had malicious intent, you can probably do most things. But hypervisor vulnerabilities are important, and that's something that you would need to think about. Think about what are the vulnerabilities that are around in terms of hypervisor, and design your own environment based on that. Think about virtual machines and how you would apply security controls to those virtual machines. Are you going to create trusted zones? If you've got different security levels on different virtual machines, then should you be hosting them in the same physical environment? Perhaps not. So again, think about some of those things when you're designing a private cloud. Security inside and outside the cloud is important, because again, in a normal environment, you're probably used to stopping people coming into your organization. The reality is the threat is just as big inside your organization. So, if you're creating a private cloud, then think about the insiders, the inside users. How are you going to, what controls are you going to put around what information they have access to? And, how are you going to separate some of the, different departments, for example, sales, HR, etc. What zones are you going to put in to make sure that your insider risk is mitigated as well? I talked a little bit about the controls that you would need in terms of things like IDS, IPsec, IPS earlier. So that's, again, a consideration. Another important consideration here is also, don't forget, there's a lot of data will actually not travel across a physical network. So if you think about virtual machines, there may be data that's been exchanged within a single environment that you don't normally see in a physical environment. So if you've got devices that you put that are actually run on a physical network, and again, DLP is a really good example, there are DLP solutions that will look for data, do data discovery, database or look for data which shouldn't be there, which actually sit on a physical network. But if data actually travels between virtual machines and doesn't actually touch a physical network, how are those controls going to work? They're not. So you need to think about how you deploy some of those controls, what data actually goes within the virtual environment, virtual machines, and apply the appropriate controls. And then the final point is around host operating systems. Again, these are all just best practices. You know, if you've got a host operating system in your private environment, make sure it's a clean environment, it's a clean machine, so you know you haven't got any ports that are open, you haven't got any guest virtual machines that can have access to that operating system. So all the things that are best practices, you know, obviously think about those when you're deploying a private cloud. The next question that we were going to look at is, you know, is security up to the cloud service provider? And I think a really good quote here is, you know, out of sight is not necessarily a good thing. It shouldn't be out of mind. It should be foremost in your mind, because you've given away all your responsibilities, that doesn't mean you don't have any responsibility. So cloud service providers, very obviously, because, you know, depending on what it is that you have, so, you know, if you have high business impact information, then obviously you want to make sure that you buy a cloud service that has all the security controls that that are appropriate and relevant to your business. But, you know, if it's just pure number crunching, then that's something that, you know, you could deploy. And in fact, a lot of organizations are thinking of deploying cloud services in that manner. So again, if you think of financial organizations, what they're saying is, you know, our really important data, if it's high business value information, we're not going to put that in the cloud. But if we need to buy processing power for something specific, then that's where we would deploy a cloud service. So it's short-term use specifically for doing something, but not necessarily to use as a long-term cloud service for some of those organizations. So again, just because you're using cloud service provider, that doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, you can give all the trust and control away. So again, Steve already talked about some of the standards that are appropriate and relevant in terms of cloud service providers. So this is the Cloud Security Alliance standard that he referred to this morning. And it's probably one of the best standards that is around in terms of cloud security, because there isn't really a cloud security standard as such. There are guidelines. There are lots of different guidelines. A lot of them, as we heard this morning, are really to do more with the procedures rather than the standard itself. The Cloud Security Alliance publishes this standard, and what we've done is we've taken all of those controls. I think there's 13 different areas within the Cloud Security Standard, and that actually translates to something like 195 questions. So what we've done as a solution is taken those controls and automated those controls within one of our GRC tools. So what this means is that if you're building a private cloud, then this is a really good way to effectively assess yourself. So to make sure that if you're deploying a private cloud yourselves, then you can use this tool to give you a measure of how well you're implementing security controls based on industry standards. And I think I may have. So this is a screenshot of what you'd effectively see. So you can see all those 13 that I mentioned there, and then you've got a score there which suggests whether you would go with that particular service provider or not. Now, it could be used to buy a service from a third-party cloud service provider. So this could be a tool that you could use to you know, if you were looking at, I don't know, 5 different service providers, then this could be a tool you could use to see who best meets your particular security requirements. So that's one way of doing it. It also means that if you've got security, if you've got data that's not of high value, then, you know, again, you could use this tool because, you know, if somebody comes up with a low score, but, you know, the cost model is good for that, then in that particular example, obviously, it would be a good match. So again, a really useful tool to to use in terms of being able to automate the cloud service provider requirements. Another example, another proof point, and this is actually a POC that we did with Intel and with VMware, is really to look at how cloud service providers, should we evacuate? So this is an example of how cloud service providers can offer a differentiated service. So how do you provide a service and say, this is the gold, the platinum, or the bronze version, and how do you give the tenant, the client, some kind of control or some kind of visibility of their data? So if you give them a dashboard and say, this is your data, Mr. Customer, and even though behind that dashboard everything else is is provided by a cloud service provider, that gives you some level of control in terms of what you're actually seeing. So what we did in this POC is two things. The first thing is really making sure that the entire stack is secure. If you remember, I mentioned that the first thing you should do is follow basic hardening guidelines. So one of the things is if you're going to build your entire private cloud on a stack, what is the common denominator at the bottom? Here it's a chipset. So using the Intel Trusted Execution Technology chipset, which actually uses hardware encryption to check the entire stack and create an image of that and store it in hardware encryption within the chipset itself, so that every time that system is actually brought up, so every time you boot that system up or power it up, it'll actually check to see if there's anything alien in its family, and if there is, then it can say, well, there's something wrong, and actually fire up a security alert. So that's one of the things that's part of this POC. And again, service providers are very interested in this because it allows them to have some kind of control in terms of what the entire stack looks like. And the reason they're concerned about that, incidentally, in terms of service providers, is because there are attacks that you can get at the hypervisor layer, which today are totally undetectable by the normal security technologies. So if that's the case, and you can get into a hypervisor and you are in a data center environment, then obviously there could be potentially a risk there based on the design that you have within the data center. So that's one thing. The other part of the solution is that we demonstrated some integrations with our GRC platform, which is called Archer, which actually gives the tenant effectively a dashboard of their data. So by doing that, a service provider can offer differentiated services because now the tenant can actually see where that data is and what's happening to it, and also deploy controls so that if you have, in the finance community, for example, there's a maker-checker rule, which is effectively the same as having a safe and having two people who hold the keys. You could do the same in this environment. So you could have somebody from the service provider who has one key, somebody from the tenant who has the other key, and if you want to make some specific changes to that environment, then the two of you can do it together. So again, that's a lot of control in the cloud service provider environment. Multi-tenancy is obviously important. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to talk quickly. Secure multi-tenancy is something that everybody talks about, everybody knows of the term. And these are some of the definitions in terms of how we would see it in terms of multi-tenancy. So being able to host multiple customers, or even in a private cloud environment, different departments, if you like, within the same physical environment. So how can you apply your security controls to those specific areas? So looking at things like trusted zones, and secure multi-tenancy. Obviously, in a service provider environment, it means something completely different. In a service provider environment, you would need to look at separation for each of those tenants. Another interesting thing I think we'll see when it comes to cloud service providers is that they will specialize in specific verticals. So really looking at cloud service providers that will specialize in protecting citizen information. So, you know, a G-Cloud, a government cloud environment. You will see financial services customers using specific cloud service providers who specialize in just hosting financial information. So I think you'll see a lot of vertical specific cloud service providers emerging in the next few years as well. Another interesting concept when it comes to cloud service providers is that today, if you buy a cloud service, then the integration from the customer to the cloud service provider is a one-to-one integration. So obviously, if you keep doing that, and if you have multiple customers, then you end up, and multiple cloud service providers, you end up with a many-to-many equation on either side of that. And the way that you can solve that, the many-to-many equation, is to put something in the middle. So what we've got in the middle there is something called a Cloud Trust Authority. And again, this is something that we announced last year, and it's a concept at the moment, and we're actually talking to cloud service providers to get them to buy into the cloud, the Cloud Trust Authority in the middle. So it's not something that RSA or EMC will be doing. We're purely providing some of the technology and the integrations that you would need to be able to do that. One of the first things that's going to be part of that service is identity and its federation. Federation has always been a challenge in the cloud. So if you've got multiple cloud service providers, and again, you know, Steve touched on it this morning, if you've got multiple cloud service providers and you've got individuals who are having access to that environment, then you need to make sure that from a federation and identity perspective, you've got the right controls in place. So that's one of the first things we'll be doing, but obviously looking at the infrastructure and information in the future as well. So watch this space in terms of the Cloud Trust Authority. So what do you need to build a trusted cloud? I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip some slides. So to build a trusted cloud, I think to have trust, you need two really important things. And I mentioned those two things earlier. And that's control and visibility. If you have those two things, then that gives you a measure of trust. If you can actually see what's going on within your environment and you have a level of control in that environment. If you translate that to the secure transaction that I introduced you to earlier, so the information, the identity, and the infrastructure, then we'll look at each one of those I's individually. So the first one is information. So in terms of information, the cloud doesn't really know data. It's information blind, effectively. It doesn't really care, recognize that this piece of information is sensitive and this isn't. So you need to ensure that you have the right controls associated with that piece of information. So deploying things like those information-centric controls that I talked about. The other important thing about cloud is mobility and geolocation. Geolocation is quite a challenge, particularly within the EU, because there are certain types of data we know within the EU that either can't leave the EU. So if you're deploying a cloud service provider, if you're deploying a service, you need to ensure that that piece of information either is within the EU or stored in any of the safe harbor countries that are appropriate for that piece of information. So those are some of the things that you would need to consider in terms of information. In terms of the information itself, and I touched on this earlier when we talked about DLP, if you haven't done the due diligence, you haven't done your homework, you haven't done the data discovery, you haven't classified your data, then those are all the things that you should be doing and you need to think about. If you don't know where your data is, you can't apply the controls to it. So obviously, that's something you need to think about. And then cloud storage based on policy. So if you have data which is, I don't know, citizen information, and you need to apply the EU privacy law to that, and it needs to be stored within the EU, then you should be able to do that based on policy. So looking at some of the controls that allow you to do that. The infrastructure piece, we've probably touched on a little bit as well. Inspecting the cloud foundations is some of the solutions that I talked about in terms of the POC that I talked about with Intel. So that really allows you to inspect everything from the foundation up. So from looking at the chipset itself, and then looking at what's actually sitting on top of that chipset. And then obviously if you've got that level of trust, then you can start building your multi-tenancy environment in that. Looking at identity, as I said, federation is the most important or the most challenging thing in the cloud today, and that's one of the things that we'll be addressing with the CTA. But obviously there are multiple points when you think about identity. So, we have things like mobile identities, we have social media platforms. So multiple identities in a cloud environment becomes really challenging. And this is a question that comes up all the time when I run workshops around tables, around some of the challenges in terms of identity. So, even if you remove the cloud, what are the sort of things that you need to be thinking about when you think about identity itself? One of the other areas that you could also look at is looking at high-risk transactions. So looking at, I talked about service providers that are looking at adapting their security based on on real-time change, so what's actually happening, looking at behavior types, looking at high-risk transactions. So all of those things are obviously things that you could take into account. And then the final thing is that if you've got those three things, if you're protecting information, identities, and infrastructure, how do you manage that? If you have a siloed approach, then that doesn't give you total visibility. So you need to have control and visibility, which is unified. So if you can have a composite view of what's happening within that environment, then obviously that will help you deploy the cloud and mitigate your risk following the best practices. So my final slide, and I know I'm over time, as usual. Really the bottom line is I addressed some of the questions that were raised, but really the cloud offers a huge opportunity. So you should deploy the cloud, provided you're doing some of the right things, following some of the best practices that I talked about. So really, the risks are there, but you really need to make sure that you've done your homework and you've got your security policies in place before you actually go and start deploying some of the cloud services that we talked about. Don't really wait for everything to line up, because if you do, you'll be left behind. And I think a lot of organizations are finding that today already. They're under a lot of pressure to reduce cost, and a really good way, obviously, to reduce cost and maintain the business that they need to do is by deploying cloud. So you've really got to start deploying some of those services. I've just unplugged something. So security is, as I said, it's a perceived risk. Hopefully this morning what you've heard from both myself and Steve gives you some kind of assurance in terms of all the things that are going on in terms of security and how, if you if you do your homework, choose the right kind of service provider, or even build your own private cloud, then that will give you some ways to give you some of those controls that we talked about. And I think a hybrid cloud is probably going to be the most popular choice of most organizations, certainly to start with. So make sure you follow some of the best practice guidelines in terms of creating your private cloud. And then at some point, you probably will be deploying some public services, and that gives you a really good mixture. And also, when I talk about hybrid, I talk about your existing physical environment as well. There are lots of reasons why you may not be able to move everything into a public cloud. It could be application or technology associated. So think about those and how you can actually manage and control the entire hybrid environment. So as I said earlier, the real risk is really not an IT risk, but it's really a business risk. If you don't deploy the cloud today or start deploying some of the cloud services, then as a business, you're actually risking what it means to you as a business rather than what it means specifically to IT. I think that was my last slide. Thank you.